Dear listeners, there is a kind of pain that doesn't always announce itself. It lives in the silences, the ways we brace for disappointment, the stories we inherit without ever hearing them, spoken loud. Trauma doesn't end with the person who survived it. It travels, it settles into the nervous system of children and the grandchildren, shaping how we hold ourselves in the world. And here's the thing, like we don't always know like we are carrying it. So today we are going to talk about what it means to carry that weight, and more importantly how we begin to set it down. So welcome to My Means Machine. I'm your host Avik, and this is the podcast where we slow down, ask the questions that matter, and let honesty lead the way. So we are not chasing quick fixes and all everything. So we are just looking at the deeper patterns, the ones that shape how we live and relate and heal. And today I'm joined by a very lovely guest. Please welcome Caroline Crocker. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Caroline. And dear listeners, like before we get into the discussion, I'll quickly love to introduce you, Caroline. So Caroline is a speaker, author, and someone who has spent years exploring how trauma moves through the families and what it takes to truly heal. So I do not want to take much time. Let's get started. So Caroline, like I think a lot of people hear the term like intergenerational trauma and assume that it's only about the big, obvious events, wars, displacement, violence, and all. But I wonder, like, if that's too narrow. So, what is the common misunderstanding people have about how trauma actually gets passed down?
Well, I think any trauma affects the person that it happens to. And so that can easily be passed on to their children, even something that one would consider normal, perhaps, in past generations, children frequently died in families. And so you can see how the parents who experience the death of a child would treat their living children differently and how that could be passed down. So I think that any trauma can be passed down. I don't personally have experience with some of those. The trauma in my family came as a result of World War II. And so that's what I can speak to with much more authority.
Got it. Got it. So, like, I mean, it's not always about remembering the story, but also about absorbing the emotional residue. So, how does that show up in a family where nobody talks about what happened?
Well, the thing is that kids assume their parents are normal,
Okay.
and because they don't know anything different, so they don't know that this is not a normal way of behaving, and so it does get passed down. For
Okay.
example, when I was a child, I thought that it was normal that if you touch your father when he's sleeping, he will lash out and try and hit you. Yeah. And then it was only when I began writing his story, which is in the book Unforgivable, that I realized he was raised in an abusive orphanage, what was a children's home. And so if somebody touched him in the night, they may be going to hurt him. And so that's why he lashes out even, to until he died. It's so I just thought it was normal, but then I realized, oh, actually, no, that wasn't normal. That's, not all men do that.
Yeah.
And so, when I first got married, I was very cautious with my husband in case,
Okay.
if I woke him up, he might hurt me. And then I discovered that's not that's not the way
Yeah.
everybody is.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a serious trauma, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah,
Obviously.
I was just saying that, there's something else that I grew up with, which I thought was normal, was my mother always told us to eat out of the front of the refrigerator because the back of the refrigerator, it had been there for so long, it was probably no longer edible. And it never really occurred to me to wonder why she would save food far past the expiration date or why she would save a tablespoon of leftover dinner. But
Mm,
then when I was writing her story with her, it's called Brave Face, I found out that she went through the hunger winter when there was no food for almost a year in her part of the Netherlands. And that even 2 years after the war, when the government sent people to the schools to see which child was worth feeding and which one was not. And they decided she was not, because she was so skinny she would die even if they fed her. That had direct effects. And she actually blew up her cheeks to show them how fat she was. And because of that, they did put her into a feeding program, and she did survive. She's actually 91. She lives with me, and she still hides food in her bedroom. So, and that was the effect of trauma. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that makes so much of sense. I mean, we learn to carry the tension before we learn to kind of name it. And it's not the stories we tell, but the ones we avoid that kind of, I mean, obviously that end up shaping us the most. So, I mean, when you think about why some families carry trauma forward and others seem to metabolize it kind of differently, like what do you think? I mean, makes the difference?
Yeah, I found it very interesting when I began writing the story about mom that I went through and wrote down the stories she told us while we were growing up. And they were funny stories about,
Yeah.
things that she did, and, spitting on people's heads and, just stuff like that. She was a naughty child. And then I showed her that and I said, "Hey, mom, is that going to make a book?" And she said, "Well, you forgot the rest." And I said, "No, you never told me." And so
Yeah.
those were the stories that she never told me. And then over the next 5 years, we talked through all those other stories, the much more traumatic stories. And I got to
Mm.
know her on a much deeper level than I had before. Now, my father was gone before I started writing his book. And so I only found out through a lot of research what happened to him. And I have to say that I had to take breaks in writing the book, because what I hadn't realized while he was alive, I only
Mm.
found out when he was gone, which is he suffered from attachment disorder, and because of the way he was treated as a small boy. So that was fairly disturbing. Yeah, to find out, because he didn't just have to deal with war, he also had to deal with a neglectful mother and somebody who didn't show him any love. And that brought me to the next question, which is, why did she act like that? And so, that just goes back the generations.
Exactly, exactly. I totally agree. I mean, you made me remember my own childhood days. So, I mean, I was also very, very naughty. I mean, it's not only very, varies will be kind of very less, but it is more than very. So I remember one incident. Like what happens is like you mentioned about that girl who was naughty. I mean, we're talking about, right. So she used to spit on the heads and all, right. So but for me it was like, so most of the time what happens, like, so my father was into defense, and because of that we need to travel. Like most of the times me and my mother will be traveling most of the times.
Mm.
So what happens, like when there is a kind of lot of public queues and all, and my mother is in front and I'm just behind her, so she's also trying to make sure that I also come along with her. So what I used to do is, just to make faster, so suppose we are in a train and maybe somewhere around it got crowded. So what I'll do when we have to get down, I'll just do kind of this to people's back. Okay. So people will obviously give you that side, right? So I remember those incidents. So there are a lot of, but I thought like I'll share this. And it's when you pick people's back, people will just get conscious and give you a side, right? So yeah.
Good plan. Maybe I should start trying that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, obviously, that distinction feels very important, and kind of turning towards, I mean, towards doesn't mean kind of wallowing. So, if also if we talk about daily life, right? If someone who is listening right now and suspects that they are carrying something that didn't start with them, and what might they notice in their own patterns and their reactions? So, what do you have to say?
Sorry.
Want to have a glass of water?
No, I'm fine. Sorry, you'll probably have to cut that out. Anyway, yes. What would they? Hmm. It's hard to know. I think it does help to talk to friends and see what they have to say. If they've noticed things that are not normal. I learned through experience. For example, my mom, she raised me with an unhealthy fear of men. And I didn't know where that came from, but when I began doing the book with her, I realized because as she described her father's activities during World War II, I realized, oh,
Hmm,
he was working with the resistance. And
exactly.
so, and because some of the Dutch people were cooperating with the Nazis, and you couldn't tell who those were because they looked like Dutch people, they talked like Dutch people, her
Hmm,
father taught her to be very careful with all men and taught her they're dangerous. Well, as a small child, she was only 5 when the war began. She absorbed this and didn't know why, but she just knew that men are dangerous. So, of course, that's what she taught me. And I believed her because that's what she told me. And it was only when my own sons became teenagers and I realized, they're just people, that I realized actually they're not, they're just people. So it was a very freeing thing. But it took that long for me to realize. And it was only then when she talked to me about her experiences, which was what, maybe 7 years ago, that I realized where that came from. And it's interesting, she cannot let go of it. She still believes that. It was that ingrained within her by her father. And he had to do it. That kept her and her sister safe. But those kind of attitudes, they are maybe safer in the circumstances, but maybe not in the future, not for future generations. But it's hard to be aware that what you were taught maybe isn't actually
hmm.
helpful. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly true. So, I mean, this really sounds like, I'd say, the cues that most people would overlook. So, if someone starts to recognize those patterns in themselves, then what is the first step that doesn't feel kind of overwhelming?
A lot of parents won't talk about it. I mean, certainly my father never talked about his wartime experiences. And when I've spoken to Jewish friends of mine, they say their parents, and their grandparents, they never talked about what they experienced because it was too traumatic. And in fact, I had much contact with a young man who went through a very traumatic childhood, and I did what the American psychologists tell you to do, which was encourage him to talk about it. And he had a breakdown. And the psychiatrist told me when the trauma is this severe, they should not talk about it. And so, there are times when, you are aware perhaps that you've been taught something that is abnormal and that is not healthy, and you're not going to be able to talk to your parents about it because they can't. And then I think maybe talking to a therapist, if there, is one that you can find around. Personally, I found it helpful to talk with my friends at church and get their view on things. And so, I think it's always in connecting with other people. People can quite often help you to sort out what's normal and what is abnormal about your behavior and
Exactly.
maybe your responses. Yeah.
Exactly true. So, I mean, obviously, I love that, and it's not excavation, but it's a gentle noticing. So, I mean, it's obviously a kind of, I'd say, reminder that healing doesn't have to feel like a crisis, and it can start with a single moment of awareness. So, yeah, and at the same time, like you have mentioned earlier, that how we respond to the trauma shapes how we heal from it. So, what is the kind of practice or mindset that you have found actually helps people move through this and not around it?
Mm. Do you know something? Right now, I'm working on a book which will be coming out in November. It's called "The Truth Was Different," and it
Okay.
is about my father's mother, my grandmother. I really didn't know her. I maybe met with her 3 times during my life, and but when I was writing the book about my father, I realized, man, this was a really mean lady. She just had no feelings whatsoever. And so I did a lot of research to find out why. Well, this poor woman experienced every kind of trauma that you could even imagine. And she shut down emotionally. She also made a very unfortunate decision, and that was the decision not to forgive. She decided not to forgive her father, and she didn't even go to his funeral. She decided not to forgive her mother. Her mother was in jail and needed somebody to testify for her, and she refused to go. She cut her brother off. She died a very lonely and sad woman because she decided not to forgive. I was very interested then in speaking to her nieces, my father's cousins, because her brother, during the war, he actually was he and his wife and his children were all sent to Auschwitz. His entire family died there. He was one of the very few people who survived. And it was only as a result of it, because he was in the he was sick at the time, and so he was in the hospital, and so the Nazis, didn't manage to kill him. So, you know, but he had way more trauma than my grandmother's. I guess it's my great uncle. And he did come out a very broken man. But his third wife's mother, his mother in law, said to him, "You need to forgive. You need to forgive through the power of Jesus." And that was just incredible to me because his daughters, he had five more children after he lost his entire first family, all daughters. And they all say that their father was known by the phrase, forgive, forgive, and then forgive. And that to me is just mind blowing that he could have forgiven that, that he was, his two daughters, I think they were 9 and 11, were both, killed. His wife was pregnant after she gave birth. They threw the baby against the wall and murdered the baby, and then she died. And his little boy, who was just a toddler, was also killed. And he forgave. And I'm just like, I don't know. I can't even imagine that I'd be able to do that. But I do know that even though he never achieved full healing, of course not. But he was a more functional person than my grandmother was. And I suspect that was why.
Correct. So, like, I mean, if we talk about, because healing is not a kind of linear, so there are setbacks, regression, moments when kind of old patterns flare back up. How do you help someone understand that without losing hope?
Yeah, that's a tough one. My husband and I have over our years taken in a lot of very broken teenagers. And I remember one who was just so broken. And yeah, she was like a roller coaster. Sometimes she would be flying high and sometimes she would be completely broken under the pain of her childhood. And it was just something where we needed to tell her, it's not a straight path. You get better and then you're going to go down. But every time you go down less far. And then you emerge, and then so it's just like a staircase. But I don't know how to describe it. But you go up, you go down. Actually, it's the same as physical healing. If you've ever had surgery, you know that you begin to feel better, and you have a high day, and you're like, I'm so good, and then the next day you feel like crud again. And,
Yeah.
you know, and that's the way the healing goes. It goes up and
Hmm.
down, but every up is a little higher and every down is a little bit less high or is a little bit less low. And, you get there in the end, or at least you get closer. So it does take time. Yeah, it takes time. And it'd be nice if everything could be fixed overnight. It can't. It's
Exactly. It can't. It can't. Definitely not. So, and obviously that reframe, I mean, it changes everything. So, I mean, a setback cannot, I mean, it's not a failure. It cannot be cannot, but it's not a failure. It's the kind of information, and it's the nervous system showing us what still needs attention. So, I mean, that turns discouragement into curiosity. So, and if you have to give one advice to the listeners today, what will you give?
I would say forgive. And as much as it is up to you, forgive. And forgiveness does not mean, and I think this is so important to stress, it does not mean saying that what was done to you doesn't matter. It does not mean saying that what was done to you wasn't bad. Because if it wasn't bad and it doesn't matter, why bother forgiving? You shouldn't be
Mm,
mad. And
correct.
so it's not saying that it wasn't wrong. It's just saying that the vengeance is not yours, that you are not the one who has to take revenge on this. And, somebody else will. I believe that God will keep that, but, it's not you. And so, yeah, I would say forgive as much as you are able to. And, that also is difficult. I remember a lady whose her husband had attacked her daughters from a previous marriage. And she really could not forgive that. So she said, okay, I'm willing to be willing to forgive. And that's as far as she could go. But you know what? She did make it the rest of the way eventually. And I think that's something, but that doesn't mean trusting him again.
Correct.
It doesn't mean
Exactly.
saying that it wasn't wrong. It just means saying, I'm not going to hold that in me because it's actually harming me. And I think that's something that is I think people don't often realize that holding a grudge doesn't hurt the person you're holding a grudge against. It hurts you. Yeah.
Exactly. So if listeners wants to connect with you, how they can connect?
I have a website, and that's the best way. That's where all my books are. And there's also places you can contact me there. And it's called ramblingruminations.com. So it's https://rambling ruminations.com. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. So, dear listeners, what I'll do is I'll put all the links, details, everything into the show notes for your easy reference. And also, Caroline, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, the examples, the details that you shared. It's really helpful. And for all the listeners, thank you so much for being here. And this work, the work of noticing, of kind of turning towards what we have inherited, it doesn't happen all at once, but it does happen one breath, one conversation, one moment of awareness at a time. So, with this hope, I'll say until next time, take care of your mind and remember that you are not just surviving what came before you, you are rewriting what comes next. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.